budgets. Well, I would say to my colleague from Alabama, who's the ranking member on the Budget Committee, that I got on the Budget Committee in this session of Congress and have been on it now for 2 years, and we haven't written a budget either year. So it sort of begs the question about whether or not the committee has any relevance around here anymore. But, you know, to the point about spending and debt, you know, we get down here, we talk about it. I think it's been really interesting. The former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, who up until several months ago held that position, would come in front of Congress, in front of congressional committees, and say that the greatest threat to America's national security is our national debt. Now, you know, there are a lot of external threats the United States faces, and the world continues to be a dangerous place, and Al-Qaeda, and the Iranian nuclear capability, and China, and North Korea, you can go right down the list. But for the top-ranking military official in this country say that the greatest threat to America's national security is our national debt speaks volumes about what our priority ought to be. And to think that we here in the United States Senate now for over 1,100 days have not passed a budget is pretty stunning in light of that reality. And also to say that somehow because the Budget Control Act last summer passed that we don't need a budget really misses the point. The reason we had the Budget Control Act is because we didn't pass a budget. The Budget Control Act is what you get when you don't pass a budget. You end up at the 11th hour having to come at the last minute to put something together to deal with the issue of the debt limit, which was what we were dealing with at that time. And it did put some caps on spending, but it doesn't do anything to deal with the long-term structural challenges facing this country, which is what a budget is designed to do. And, you know, the President submitted a budget this year which would suggest that he thought that we ought to be working on a budget. The chairman of the Budget Committee, as my colleagues have mentioned, even called a Budget Committee markup where we went there, said bring amendments, and we went and we brought amendments and we gave opening statements and we gavelled it out and said we're not going to do it. And so here we are again on the floor of the United States Senate without a budget, having to vote on other budgets presented by some of our colleagues, the House of Representatives, which passed a budget this year earlier, and the President's budget. And to be fair, the President at least submitted a budget. It was a terrible budget if you're looking at the issues of spending and debt. In fact, I think the reason that it got voted down 414 to nothing in the House of Representatives is because it added $11 trillion to the debt. It takes our total debt at the end of the 10-year period to $26 trillion and spends $47 trillion over the next 10 years, raises taxes by $2 trillion on a very fragile economy. There was a really bad attempt, but at least it was an attempt. It was an attempt that yielded 0 votes in the House of Representatives, and it'll be interesting to see if on the floor of the United States Senate today there are any Democrats who will vote for their president's budget proposal. But the point that the senator from Alabama and the senator from Missouri make is a good one, and that's just simply this. We have a responsibility under the law to spell out what we would do to get this country on a more sustainable fiscal path. That's something that's in the budget laws that the senator from Alabama pointed out. And yet here we go on year after year after year now, 3 years in a row, over 1,100 days, without the Senate doing its job and passing a budget. And that's significant for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is now this is the fourth year in a row where we're going to have $1 trillion deficit. I mean, under this administration, they had the highest deficit, the second highest deficit, the third highest deficit, and the fourth highest deficit in history. 4 years now, consecutive years of $1 trillion deficits. But we're concerned about the economy. We need the economy to get growing again, to expand, to create jobs. That helps address all these things. And what's interesting about it, and I know both my colleagues here on the floor are well aware of this, but there's a lot of research that's been done with regard to developed countries who start carrying these high debt loads. And all the analysis suggests that when you get a debt to GDP ratio of more than 90%, it costs you about 1 point to 1.5 points of economic growth every single year. Well, in our country, a percentage point of economic growth means 1 million jobs. So our debt to GDP, which is now over 100%, means that it is draining our economy of economic growth and therefore lots of jobs. The Congressional Budget Office said about the President's budget that if his budget were to be enacted, it could cost us up to 2.2% of economic growth over the course of the next 10 years, which would amount to 2.2 million jobs. So we know the President's effort was not serious. He did at least put something out there. But we need a serious discussion here in the United States Senate about a budget that will put us on a pathway not only to get spending and debt under control, but to allow the economy to grow and expand and get Americans back to work. That's what's at stake here. That's really why we believe we ought to have a budget. That's why we're going to have an exercise today where at least we get a chance to vote on some budgets as advanced by some of our colleagues in the House of Representatives as well as here in the Senate and the President's budget. But the fact of the matter is that this is the third year in a row when we haven't followed the law and gone through the process of getting a budget here on the floor of the United States Senate. And for our colleagues to suggest on the other side that it's not necessary simply because the Budget Control Act was passed last summer not only is inconsistent with the law, but it begs the point about why did the President submit a budget? Why did they call a Budget Committee markup in the first place? I mean, clearly somebody around here thinks that we ought to be doing our job, but we're not doing it. And so I would hope that as we debate this issue today, that at least we'll put in front of the American people the arguments that we think need to be made with regard to getting spending and debt under control, addressing the long-term, the mandatory side of the budgets that my colleague from Missouri, Senator Blunt, mentioned. That's where we know the money is. That's what nobody wants to deal with. We keep squeezing a little bit more out of the discretionary side of the budget. We have got to take on, if we're going to save Social Security and Medicare and reform these entitlement programs, that's what a budget process would do. It doesn't take 60 votes under the law. It takes 51. So to come down here and say that, the Republicans would just filibuster, again, is completely out of whack with what we know to be the facts around here in the law, and that is that it's 51 votes to pass a budget and a reconciliation bill that could possibly follow. So I appreciate my colleague from Alabama, his leadership as the ranking member on the Budget Committee, and I look forward today at least to the chance for us to at least talk about a budget and what we ought to be doing for the future of this country, since we really don't have a budget on the floor of the United States Senate. Well, I'll just say, if the Senator will yield for a minute, that I assume in Alabama and Missouri, I know that in South Dakota, our states pass budgets. It can be done. You can balance your budget. It would be nice if we had a requirement in the Constitution that would demand that, like many of our states do. Certainly, there doesn't seem to be the political will here to do it absent that, but it can be done, and hard decisions have to be made. South Dakota went through it last year, made some hard choices. Our governor, our legislature, those are the types of hard decisions that are going to have to be made here, but it takes a certain amount of political will and the willingness to make hard decisions. And as the Senator from Alabama and the Senator from Missouri have both pointed out, there doesn't seem to be the willingness here to make those hard votes. As has already been pointed out, the leader has said on the other side that, what point is there in doing a budget? And the President of the United States and his folks, when they were asked about whether or not the Senate ought to do a budget, said, well, we don't really have an opinion about that, which I think is really ironic coming from the leader of the free world about whether or not this country ought to have a budget to work with. But that being said, I think as our time winds down here, to argue, as our colleagues have, that we don't need one, the American people expect it and the taxpayers deserve it. And that's why we ought to be having a debate on what we're going to vote for today, not what we're going to vote against. And it'll be interesting to see if any of our colleagues on the other side vote for any of the budget proposals that will be put forward today, including the President's. The President of the United States, his budget will be voted on along with several other Republican budgets. I got a feeling we'll be for some things. I got a feeling that, as you said earlier, they're not going to be for anything.